and attempt to snatch a grid Papa Uniform 259er, 119er, break. Enemy is unaware of our presence at this time, over. Solid copy. Hitman 2-3.
Hey, good evening, everybody. This is Ben Powers coming at you from the Commander's Voice. My guest tonight is Marty Morgan. He's a friend of the show. He's been on before. He's an author who's written about the 507th Parachute Infantry. He has been a technical advisor on a variety of television programs of historical import, and he is also a battlefield tour leader, as well as a master's degree historian who has worked at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. So just an incredible CV. We're thrilled to have him. Marty, thank you for coming back on the show.
Ben, thank you very much for inviting me, and thanks for the many compliments.
So with that roll up, or roll out, I should say, when Marty and I talk, we normally wind up talking airborne, and we normally wind up talking European theater of operations. And folks who know D-Day, folks who know 507th will know Marty's name. However, he's a historian of all things World War II, and he's just come back from a battlefield tour in the Pacific. And so tonight we're going to be discussing, American operations in the Pacific theater in World War II based off the last series of tours that Marty gave. So Marty, just to kick it off, could you kind of give the audience a rundown of what your itinerary was on this last tour?
This trip was a lot of fun. Actually started in the Republic of Palau. And that, of course, when you go to Palau, you go for Peleliu, but also did some exploring on Koror. And also, for the first time, did some exploring on Babeldaob, the largest island of the Palau archipelago. From there, on to the big three, my favorite, Guam, Saipan, and Tinian. After having spent time in Marianas, touring sites there, pushed on and finished up in Hawaii because I'm very interested in the Pearl Harbor attack. So when we ended up on Oahu, we spent a lot of time talking about December 7th.
Very cool. So it sounds almost like just things were done, I don't want to say in reverse per se, but when you start, when you wind up in Hawaii talking December 7th, after you've been, going through the Central Pacific Islands, it's kind of like, okay, maybe we should have been heading west instead of east. But was that just a logistics issue, or how did that work out?
Logistics issue, and it worked out like this. It was going to be, because I work for a company called Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours, Ambrose Tours, I was going to have a group. And every year when the Japanese government allows us to visit Iwo Jima, they allow Americans onto Iwo Jima 1 day per year.
Wow.
And what that results in, that day is usually like the middle or maybe the third Saturday of March every year. And so what the company ends up doing is building an itinerary around the Iwo Jima trip. And it's a day trip that's run out of Guam. And so the way that the itinerary usually shakes out for that trip is that we start on Oahu, talking about December 7th, make our way to the Marianas Islands. We go to Saipan first to sort of follow the campaign of the Marianas in chronological order. Then we visit Tinian, and then we push onward from there to Guam. We then have the Iwo Jima day trip. And after touring Guam, we push onward to Palau and visit Peleliu. That's how it usually lines up. The Iwo Jima trip got canceled at the last minute this year, and that led everyone into a scramble. So I was going to have my Ambrose Tours group, followed by a private client, where they were going to meet me at the end of the Ambrose tour. So I was going to go Hawaii, Guam, Saipan, Tinian, Iwo Jima, and then Peleliu, finish up with Ambrose. And then a client I was going to meet at the airport in Palau, and then do everything in reverse order. The Ambrose trip fell through because Iwo Jima got canceled at the last minute, unfortunately. So I rushed all the way to Palau just to work my way all the way back across the Pacific in the opposite of chronological order.
Tracking. So just to let me, widen the aperture just a little bit for what I'm wondering is, when you work for Stephen Ambrose Historical Tour, so obviously you do stuff in Europe, you do stuff in the Pacific. My gut is telling me when you're doing Europe, you get people who may have enjoyed Band of Brothers, you get people who want to go to Europe anyway, so they enjoy the historical tour, but maybe they spend some time in Paris, they do some other stuff. When you're going to the Pacific, are you getting a more hardcore audience? Because it's, first off, it's a bigger trip. Secondly, like, you're going there, especially when you get out when you're in Oahu, I get it. There's other things to do, but as you get out into the Pacific Islands, there's not a lot of quaint little shops you can have a little, break in. You're there and you're kind of immersed in it. So is it people who are just more hardcore? Is it people whose relatives fought in the Pacific theater? Like, what is your audience makeup for a Pacific trip versus a Europe trip?
You've already identified it. I get a lot of people that are interested because of a family connection. They are motivated because of the family connection, or else this is a once in a lifetime trip for people who have been reading about this subject all their lives. Whereas the European tours are a lot of people that are still sort of in the afterglow of Private Ryan and Band of Brothers, and they're very interested in the subject because of those. Not so much every now and then family members, but strangely, I'm getting more of that for these trips to the Pacific. The wild thing, though, is that I end up telling people this when it's not a hard sell to get people to come to Europe. The flights are closer. As it turns out, they're kind of about the same price because Europe is expensive. It's culturally a bit more familiar. The flight times are much, much shorter. And so people like to do that because they also will, out of the average D-Day tour or Band of Brothers tour, they're going to get some London time, some Paris time, some time in the Netherlands, maybe even some time in Munich, because we often offer an extension that goes down to Berchtesgaden into the Eagle's Nest. For the Pacific, it seems like you're just going to be trudging across undeveloped islands. And while that is definitely actually the case in many places, you get strange things like I find that Guam is every bit as nice as visiting the Hawaiian Islands, and I like it better because there are fewer people there. But where we stay on Guam is in an area called Tumon Bay, and directly across the street, there's a duty-free mall that includes Cartier and Louis Vuitton and Birkenstock and other examples of couture and consumer culture, and it's right there. And that has all been built up on Guam because it's easy. It's an easy trip for Japanese people to come to Guam. It's kind of like for them to go to Guam is kind of like for us to go to the United Kingdom or to go to France.
Got it.
And no one is living rough on Guam or Saipan. We usually don't get to spend the night on Tinian. Tinian is not, it has places to spend the night, but it doesn't have resorts the way that we have on Guam and Saipan. It's when we get to Palau where sort of the easy living stops. That's not to say that there aren't resorts there, because the nicest resort that I ever get to stay at is in Palau on the island Koror, a place called the Palau Pacific Resort. It's magnificent. But you have to eventually walk out of the resort, get on a boat, and that boat will take you to Peleliu. And Peleliu is not a comfortable visit. Even if you do it like I did it this year, which is the only way we could fit it in was with a one-day excursion where we sailed down an hour by boat to get to Peleliu. And then we had to go back to Koror that night. And there's a reason for that. And that reason is a very challenging and changing world. All of the hotel accommodations on Peleliu, and there are plenty of places to stay, but they're all taken up now by the military and military contractors. And what that did was it forced us into a day trip. And so that was an accelerated Peleliu visit. We could have done it 2 days in a row where we went down by boat and did our exploring and then went back to Koror that night, but that's an hour one way. And it's a bit much, but that's the way the ball bounces with Peleliu right now. And there's quite a lot to see there. And maybe you've noticed from some of my postings on social media, the island has been, as a battle site, it's incredible. It's also extremely dangerous in that there's UXB everywhere. And that's after multiple different campaigns to clean up all of the UXB on the island, as well as clean up the bodies. And there are still bodies being found, and there's still a lot of UXB out there. But it's an incredible place to visit. It's just a little complicated there right now.
Tracking. And you actually I was not expecting that answer. That's fascinating, but you've also given me a perfect segue, because you've articulated the strategic importance of that, archipelago, and the whole reason you go on these tours and the whole reason that we were fighting across that part of the Pacific during World War II likewise had some very strategic import. So usually when folks tune into my show and we're talking ETO, we don't go into a big strategic discussion because pretty much everybody kind of gets it, why we staged out of England for D-Day and why we were liberating France. I hesitate to say, hey, could you run down 4 years of, combined strategy in 3 minutes here? But that's basically what I'm asking you to do. Could you give us a quick overview of what the strategy was that wound up with needing to take all these islands?
I think I could do it in less than 3 minutes, in fact. And that is that early in the war, the United States is driven out of the Philippines. And where we have this major surrender of American forces, first at Bataan and then followed by Corregidor. General MacArthur famously said, I will return. And we have to fight multiple campaigns to get back there. As a part of the planning, the vision for warfare in the Pacific imagined a Central Pacific campaign that would lead eventually to the Marianas and the establishment of very long-range bomber bases, making use of the B-29, and then a South Pacific campaign that would return American fighting forces to the Philippine Islands. At first, it was imagined that there would be a landing on the island of Mindanao in the Philippines. And as we prepared for that landing, it was recognized that Palau, which sits 600 miles east of the Philippines, it was imagined, maybe it's more like 700 miles east of the Philippines. But it was recognized that if we're going to land in Mindanao, our forces will be vulnerable to Japanese ground-based aviation flying out of the twin runways of the big Japanese Imperial Army airfield on Peleliu. And so we then came up with an idea for an opposed amphibious landing operation that it was thought would take 3 days. It was thought that there would be light casualties and that we would seize that and deny the enemy the airfield that it could use to interfere with our landings in Mindanao. To everyone's great aggravation, Mindanao is eventually, as a landing, it's ultimately canceled. But the landings on Peleliu and Angar, they are not canceled. And that battle also does not take 3 days. It takes quite a bit longer than that. And depending on how you want to count it, it's almost 100 days of combat that functionally destroys the 1st Marine Division. At any rate,
I hate to interject, but with that 100 days of combat, could you tell folks what the dimensions of that island are?
Wow, the island, I think, is, oh gosh, it's either 12 or 14 square miles. I always forget, but I'm going to check it real quick because it is remarkably small, and that smallness stands in strong contrast with the battles that were fought immediately before it, because we don't necessarily imagine that Saipan or Tinian are big islands. Wow, I was way off. 5 square miles.
Wow, so
5 square miles. I thought for some reason.
That's amazing. So you're slamming a combat veteran Marine division into an area that's small, and it takes them over 3 months to secure. That's all you have to say about the tenacity of the Japanese defense and the ferocity of what they faced.
And it's even worse than that, because that 5 square miles, the fighting within 10 days of the initial landings, the fighting quickly surrounds a pocket of resistance that's in a hill mass called the Umabrogel. It's a series of different hilltops and knobs and crests and rock walls, but we generally refer to it as the Umabrogel pocket, sometimes called Bloody Nose Ridge. And that is an area where 10 days after the landings in September, the enemy has been not completely trapped, but the enemy is surrounded within that pocket. And that pocket is about 600 meters long and about 300 meters wide. And the majority of the fighting, the majority of the meat grinder is attempting to overcome enemy positions within that pocket. So that there's, for what it's worth, you could actually periodize the opening phase of the landings at Peleliu as establish the beachhead, overrun the airfield. And then you move into the second phase, which is reduce this pocket of resistance. And that pocket of resistance, which is very small, is where the enemy is still fighting in November. And that is, it's fascinating to me to be a Peleliu educator, which is what I consider myself, because I'm taking people there, and I'm taking them up into the Umabrogel and they're seeing these sites. And I will often have these conversations. I had this conversation with the two people that traveled with me this year, and they were very much not getting it. They were very much like, how is it that, I mean, the pocket is so small. Why is it that it takes so long? We pulled the van up, got out of the van, walked up. There's a jungle trail that basically follows the perimeter of the pocket. And as we got out of the car and walked up into it, we were walking along this formation called China Wall. And both of them went, I get it. I see now that there's just nothing like it on the planet in terms of terrain, because it is an uplifted coral plateau that then developed a series of karst holes or sinkholes. So all this coral rock is shoved upward, and then it's just like fingers. Where walking along China Wall on this trail that's laid out, there are times where, and it's just exposed lava rock, I can look down 40 and 50 feet.
Wow.
And I'm on the trail right by China Wall. And I'm imagining that's more of the Marine approach. The U.S. Army 81st Division famously fights there. And when U.S. Army soldiers are fighting there are times where they send in company-size attacks, and they take very high casualties, disengage, withdraw, try to get everybody treated, try to form another attack, and eventually the soldiers succeed in gradually moving up in what's called the Wildcat Bowl area. The troops, as they're going up into the hill mass, everyone carries a sandbag with them. And that's because they're going to move into contact. And as soon as the ambush is sprung, everybody drops a sandbag and gets behind it. And that's how they survive. And I'm like, man, that is some nasty fighting right there.
It certainly is. So you as you well know, you can't write about or talk about a battle if you don't understand its terrain. And you should, if you could, you should have walked it. And so you've walked it. I have not had that opportunity. The way you're describing the coral did the Japanese even have to improve the fortifications, or could they just occupy natural strong points?
A lot of it was, it's a little bit of both, strangely, because a lot of it was there were existing caves everywhere. The island is very porous, and the enemy made use of that. But then they also improved existing caves. Like one of the famous landmarks that people visit on Peleliu, which is right up in the north side of the island near the boat dock, is the Thousand-Man Cave. And there were caves there. The Japanese came in, and using laborers, they extended this cave network that was already there and improved it to the point that it would accommodate 1,000 men.
Wow.
And then there are examples, like there is a Japanese officer named Yamaguchi who holds out on the island until well after the battle. And he and a group of men live in a cave that was completely unimproved, and nobody even knew it was there. And it's kind of a difficulty to find it even now, even though I've been to it before and I know right where it is. It's difficult to get to it. Strangely, the difficulty derives from not getting disoriented in the jungle. The difficulty becomes the way that you put your feet down as you move over jagged coral rock. And the reality is that you end up banging your ankles up a lot. And eventually, and you're so off center, and with every step, you're about to fall down and split your head open on coral. And when we went this year, we made it about halfway in, and we were like, let's just never mind. And part of the reason that we abandoned the mission was it was going to be just another cave when we got there. And then we stumbled into an area where there were about 30 fused and unexploded M49A2 60 millimeter high explosive mortar rounds.
Oh my gosh.
And we walked right into the middle of it. And I mean, to the point where, I don't know if you saw the photos I posted on social media, but they were M49A2s that were fused, where the pin had been pulled on the fuse, and there were still increment charges clipped on the tail of it.
Wow.
Where they had set up and they were ready to lay down some 60 millimeter mortar fire, and the gunners opened the tubes, pulled the mortar rounds out, unsafed them, put the increment charges on them, and laid them down. And then, 79 years later, I walked a group of people right up on top of it. Wow. And the whole time we were all like teetering and about to fall down. And I've had people suffer serious injuries on Peleliu, which is really not a problem that I have touring Normandy. And the big problem, no matter how many times you tell people, and I've done it myself, that is like when we go into the cave, watch your head. And what really needs to happen is everybody really needs to wear a helmet, because we had a guy that got into a cave, saw something interesting, stood upright too quickly, impacted with the top of the cave, and it's so jagged it was like he ran his head into like 4 or 5 razors and just split his head open, and it's just gushing blood everywhere. And so that changes the mission. Then it's no longer let's go see what we find in this interesting cave that no one's ever explored before. And then it turns into let's get you back down near the boat launch where there's at least a clinic where we can get you some medical treatment. And so when we walked in to get to the Yamaguchi cave, we walked back there. We're all like several times I fell down, but didn't fall down fully to where I injured myself, because it's impossible to walk across this terrain. You develop your time in the military probably told you, you probably experienced it yourself, where you deal with mud and difficult terrain to where you finally get to a sidewalk and you're like, oh my God, this is amazing. Civilization is incredible with
Exactly.
warm water and air conditioning and sidewalks. But and the Yamaguchi cave, we pulled the van up and we had about 200 meters to go. We made it about halfway. Everybody almost fell down and injured themselves about a dozen times. And then I looked down and we're standing in the middle of 30 unexploded 60 millimeter mortar rounds. And I was like, all right, I've had about enough Peleliu for now. Peleliu has Peleliu'd us a little too much. And we backed off the mission, because even with these people who were true diehards, and they spent a lot of money to get to Peleliu, and there was a lot of motivation to go and see this island. And even at that, after a while, you're like, if we keep going, it's just going to get more and more risky. And we don't want an injury, and we definitely don't want to have a problem with UXB. And there's still UXB all over that island.
That's amazing. So a quick aside, I've got to imagine that the waiver for this tour is extensive.
Yeah, and the fun thing is that I work with a travel and tourism company called Compass Travel, based in Columbus, Ohio. For this trip, the tour guy, the travel agent that's in charge, she is very adamant about getting people to buy the insurance, because I have not yet had a case of medically evacuating somebody, and I don't want to, but with that insurance policy, it's not something that's going to bankrupt you.
Roger. And it would bankrupt you otherwise.
It would bankrupt you if you didn't have that policy. And if you're going to go to Peleliu, you might have it. And just for the record, last year I took a group of 32 people to Iwo Jima, and no matter what I said, people listen to me. People do pay attention, but sometimes they don't pay attention quite as much as I wish they would. And I'm sure you've experienced this too. So the night before the day trip up to Iwo, I was like, all right, everybody, good night. See you in the morning. We're going to leave early, blah, blah, blah. Start drinking your water now and do not stop. You're going to drink a bunch before you go to bed, and you're just going to pee it out, and that's going to be lost to us, but go ahead and do it. Then tomorrow, you're really going to have to drink a lot of water. On Peleliu this year, the night before we went to Bibbledaub to go to they have like a Walmart, the Palau version of Walmart. Being in Palau, just so you know, you spend the US dollar, you drive on the right-hand side of the road, there are US post offices. It's like being in a more remote part of Hawaii, kind of,
Gotcha.
Except much farther away and much closer to the equator. And we went to the big Walmart equivalent store, and I bought a case of 36 bottles of water, and there were only 3 of us going. And they were like, do you think we need that much? And I was like, we definitely need this much. And during the day on Peleliu, I'm reactionary, because the first time that I ever experienced a heat exhaustion problem, which was self-inflicted because I didn't drink enough water, was on Peleliu the first time I went. And so I was like, not going to happen. I'm not going to be the victim. And by the time we got on the boat to go back to Karor at the end of one day, about 7 hours on Peleliu, I drank 12 bottles of water. And at the end of the day, I was like, yep, that did it. That's what it takes. Last year for Iwo Jima, I had 8 people that went down for heat exhaustion, where there was an ambient temperature outside of 80 degrees with a strong breeze that it's high humidity. So you're going to sweat a little bit, but with a 10, 15 mile an hour breeze, that perspiration it evaporates immediately. So you don't get a sense of, I'm overheating myself.
Right.
And you're overheating yourself. And a big problem with Iwo Jima is that you land on the airfield and everybody wants to go down on the beach and they want to go to the summit of Suribachi to the 5th Marine Division Memorial. It is a distance of 5 miles one way, and we have to walk it. There's no transportation.
Wow.
And so it's a 10-mile hike. It's not for the faint of heart. And last year, during the first mile, 8 heat exhaustion casualties.
That doesn't surprise me, actually.
And they just
like there should be like a PT test you have to take in order to take the trip.
Yeah, there needs to be a PT test. And I kept telling them, I end up sounding a little bit like a nagging old woman, because I keep telling them, I was nagging everybody, like, everybody, you got to drink water. You got to overhydrate. And on the plane on the way up, United Airlines flies the charter, and everybody's they're super charged with excitement because my God, it's Iwo Jima. I still get I still get emotional when I get there. I've done it 12 times now, and it still gets to me. And everybody's excited, and I watched everybody, because on the airplane on the way up, I kind of like went back and checked on everybody, mainly to nag them about water. And I saw people that were drinking beer, drinking cocktails. And I was like, and I came up, and I don't want to be a source of annoyance or aggravation, but I walk up and I go, that's the absolute worst thing you could be drinking right now. And they would laugh it off and they go, cheers. And they continue drinking it. And several of those people were the heat casualties that went down.
You're going to learn today, man.
You're going to learn. Iwo Jima is going to teach you a lesson. And it taught 8 people a powerful and expensive lesson, because it's not like we could come back the next day.
Right.
The Japanese allow us on the island one day a year. And the way that they were all handled, they were handled by active duty U.S. Marines who'd come up from Camp Kinser, Okinawa. And the Marines came in golf carts and collected them, took them back to the hangar where we came in, and did the only thing they can do, and that is they gave them IVs and just let them sit there, so that their time on Iwo Jima, which they had been looking forward to, consisted of about an hour of beginning the walk to Suribachi and then passing out.
That's a shame.
And it was really a shame. But for those that could make it, it was people like me. I'm not in great shape, but I do this a lot, and I think that helps me. I ended up going, I summited Suribachi with 2 brothers, and one of them was like an Ironman guy, and he just shredded it, and he was dragging my fat ass up the hill. But that's what it takes to succeed. You have to be like Ironman ready to get through that day without like having to be evacuated back to the hangar to get an IV in your arm.
That's amazing. And the takeaway I'm getting from this, besides, be prepared if you take one of these trips, it's like, that's like an immersive experience, though, both Iwo Jima or Peleliu, because just the idea of how much, these guys were lucky if they had 2 canteens, and you're trying to move water, up and down trails to get it to the troops, and they're just, so they're already dehydrated. You're talking Peleliu, you're in a combat situation, you take fire, you've been trained to go to ground, you're going to impale yourself on coral when you go to ground. Holy cats, I can't imagine more horrific conditions to fight in.
It was just consuming those troops, both the Marine Corps, the Navy, and the Army, Marine Corps and the Navy, as well as the Army. And on Peleliu, it's made so much worse by the fact that they'd come up with, we had lessons learned that brought us to the Peleliu operation. And among them, we knew that we were going to have some experienced difficulty advancing fresh water to the troops that were engaged at the MLR. And because of that, they came up with the idea of putting water in 5-gallon gas cans that were supposed to have been cleaned out, and many of them were not cleaned out, which leads to a lot of tragedy. And it leads to a lot of Marines and some soldiers drinking water out of gas cans that had not been properly cleaned out. And so they ingested gasoline. It made them sick. And I mean, it happened again on Guam, and it's the saddest tragedy of all, because there were so many war dogs. There were, I think, 3 war dog companies on Guam, and the dogs were given water that was contaminated by gasoline, and we lost 23 dogs from this contamination incident as a result of it. And there's a memorial on the Navy base on Guam to these dogs, and I have never seen grown people cry their eyes out like people that go up to the War Dog Memorial on the Navy base on Guam. That gets to everybody.
Understand.
Because I'm usually taking people that were in the military, and I've seen like hardcore Marine Corps NCOs that get up there to the dog memorial and start reading their name, and they'll start brushing tears away. It's heartbreaking, and it illustrates one of the big challenges of the Pacific. And that is keeping fresh water supplied to the fighting forces. My uncle, who served in D Company, 27th Infantry Regiment, and was part of the famous Thin Red Line action in January on Guadalcanal, he voiced that over and over again. And he was still alive when Thin Red Line came out, and we went to it, and the first thing he said, because it was depicting the battle that he was a part of, and the first thing he said was like, they're right about the water. That we couldn't keep water. We were expecting guys to keep plugging along, and there was no water coming up the hill, because that's an uphill fight into the area of the Galloping Horse on Guadalcanal. And they just couldn't keep water to them. And that was what was, of course, combat was creating casualties, but then you have a lot of non-combat casualties that are just guys that can't handle it. The human body just can't endure those conditions for long. And so they fall out. And that's not even mentioning freaking New Guinea. I've spent a lot of time in New Guinea and on the Kokoda Trail, and I did a lot of time at Rabaul in Simpson Harbor, and had heat casualty moments there. I am currently speaking to you from exactly 30 degrees north latitude, because 30 degrees north runs through this room, by the way. I checked it. And so, and I've grown up, I'm a Southerner, and I tend to think like I can handle heat. Heat's no big deal. It's nothing new to me. Like, it was 92 degrees outside today when I took the garbage out. And I was like, oh, it's a little warm. 92 degrees here at 30 degrees north is not the same 92 degrees as it is at 7 degrees north of the equator. Right. Like, it is vastly more powerful. And over again, I see, like on the trip just last month, I had a Floridian on there, and he lives in South Florida. That's somebody who knows what heat feels like. And he didn't consume enough water, and and it's cumulative. Then that's what blows my mind in this way. To go back to the point that the observation that you very correctly made, this is experiential and immersive, in that the dehydration is cumulative, and that I have to remind myself, like, yeah, I'm going to overhydrate for Peleliu. Yeah, I'm going to overhydrate for the day trip to Iwo. And maybe I'll forget about it for a day where we're in the car on Guam, and Guam is extremely comfortable. And I had a guy that it cumulatively caught up to him on Guam, where we're in and out of an air-conditioned car, and there's fast food everywhere. In fact, we couldn't find a fast food restaurant that was not represented on Guam. All of the comforts of home can be found there, and you can still get knocked on your ass from heat exhaustion because you don't drink enough water.
It's absolutely amazing. So I want to take a step back and readdress Peleliu. We've been talking tactics. We've been talking combat conditions. You brought up the point that the whole purpose of the Peleliu operation is to be able to secure the airfield where Japanese Army land-based aviation could have threatened a planned landing on Mindanao, which was then canceled. Do you know, as an historian, why Peleliu still went when the operational purpose of the mission was now obviated by canceling the Mindanao operation?
Yeah. And what I like about this question is that it addresses the elephant in the room, because what maybe where you're going with this is, why didn't we just cancel Peleliu? Or the corresponding element of it, the corresponding corollary there is that Peleliu should have been canceled. And I find that most people have a very strong opinion in favor of its cancellation. And a point I love to make about this is that we could no longer afford the luxury of bypassing that island. And I should point this out. If we had chosen to bypass Peleliu, it would have been not just bypassing Peleliu, but bypassing the entire Palau archipelago. That's 345 islands. On Peleliu, you had an Imperial Japanese Army airfield with twin-engine medium bombers that could threaten anything approaching the Philippines. Angar also had an airfield. It was more of a fighter strip. The island immediately north of Peleliu, which is called Nerebus, that had a fighter strip on it for the Imperial Japanese Army as well. Then further up the chain, about 30 miles north, is the island Koror, which is where the largest city and the capital is located. Koror was a Japanese Imperial Navy seaplane base, and also, more importantly, a Japanese Imperial Navy submarine base. Then immediately north of that is the largest of the islands in the Palau archipelago called Bebeldao. And that island had a garrison of over 32,000 men.
Oh, wow.
If we bypassed Peleliu, we're also bypassing all of those other islands. So if we simply bypassed Palau in its entirety, we would have had the Army airfield on Peleliu, the fighter airfields on Angar and Nedibus. We would have had the seaplane base and the submarine base on Koror, in addition to another Army airfield on Bebeldao that I didn't mention a minute ago, and a garrison of over 30,000 men. At this stage of the Pacific War, that overall garrison of all of these islands constituting the Japanese garrison of Palau, it was too dangerous. And we learned lessons about leaving Japanese submarine bases, now didn't we? When I take people to Tinian, we will pull up and look down on the bay where Indianapolis last anchored.
Right.
The price you pay for leaving their submarines and opportunity to continue operating is USS Indianapolis. We could no longer just leave that island group. By capturing Angar and Peleliu, we eventually briefly take Nedibus. That wasn't a part of the original plan. It was necessitated by the developing battle on Peleliu. But by fighting in the southern part of the Palau archipelago, what we're doing is we're isolating everyone else, so that suddenly it's vastly more difficult for them to make effective use of that submarine base. It's very difficult for them to operate aircraft out of that seaplane base. And Japanese seaplanes were the best of the Second World War, and they were capable of not just long-range reconnaissance and maritime surveillance. They were also they possessed a strike capability that was nothing to be trivialized. Then there was also a major island garrison in the form of the Japanese Army garrison on Bebeldao. We were at a point in the Pacific War where, if not for Mindanao, then for Leyte, then for Luzon. If we had left and I'm making the mistake that I think many of the critics make, and that is that they only imagine Peleliu by itself, removed from the context of being a part of an island group where there was incredible Japanese strength. And when you separate Peleliu out by itself, it seems like it doesn't make sense. When you imagine Peleliu within its proper context, within the aggregate of all of the strength that the Japanese wielded in Palau, suddenly I think it makes sense that we could not, as we drove up the Philippine Islands, leave this very, very important Japanese island group outpost undealt with. And so
that's a
perfect
answer,
to do it.
Actually.
We had to do it. It's just unfortunate that by doing it, it was a lot worse than we were thinking that it was going to be. And we destroyed the 1st Marine Division. We lost a lot of good Marines, a lot of good sailors, a lot of good soldiers fighting for that. And then we lost a lot of good airmen. Like a point that is, I have to remind myself of frequently, is that the U.S. Army immediately moves into that airfield and starts flying P-61 Black Widows, TBM Avengers. The Marine Corps is operating the TBM from there, as well as, in addition to fighters, the Army is operating fighters. The Army is operating B-24 Liberators that are flying up to, in a very short combat mission, up to Koror to bomb the seaplane bases and the submarine base. And we lose a lot of aircrew during those combat missions. We eventually bomb the major Japanese Imperial Army airfield on Bebeldao and put that out of action. And the effectiveness of that use of our air power would not have been possible if it was done entirely through the use of naval aviation on aircraft carriers. They just didn't have the strength, and they also didn't have the ability to loiter. Whereas by capturing Angar and Peleliu, you've got ground-based aviation, and all I got to do is fly 30 miles north to hit the target.
Unsinkable carriers at that point.
The unsinkable carriers of Angar and Peleliu. And the aggregate of that amplified out over the length of not just the campaign, but then beyond the campaign and stretching into 1945. The continuous air power assault against Japanese positions in the northern part of the Palau archipelago, it significantly weakens them at a critical time period in the war where our Central Pacific campaign has achieved great success, and the MacArthur campaign in the Philippines is becoming successful as well.
Tracking, and that's a fantastic answer, because you hit the nail on the head, that I was thinking truly operationally. Okay, we're taking Peleliu in order to be able to enable Mindanao. We're not doing Mindanao, let's not do Peleliu, but you expand that aperture to theater strategic, and it makes so much more sense. And when you talk Peleliu, people are usually thinking Eugene Sledge. They're thinking, the battle itself. They're reading about the horrific losses that were taken there. Is there anyone you would recommend as a writer, who's done history, who's addressed it the way you just summed it up, where a reader who wanted to learn more could learn more about, theater strategic?
Well, obviously, I'm a big fan of With the Old Breed on Peleliu and Okinawa by Eugene B. Sledge. I think another great voice from that period is Sidney Clark Phillips. Dr. Phillips eventually wrote a book called You'll Be Sorry, which I think is a great memoir of the Pacific War. But in terms of unpacking the strategy and the way that the war in the Pacific was fought, I think I even have a syllabus that I have already created of several authors. It used to be like back in the day, I found that the Ambrose book on D-Day, which was called D-Day, the Climactic Battle of World War II, came out in 1994. That book's not perfect. It's 40 years old at this point, and yet I still recommend it despite its problems, because it's a one-stop shop. Dr. Ambrose was working on a book like that at the time of his death that was going to be called Citizen Soldier Pacific. He never got to finish that. And to an extent, his son, Hugh Ambrose, who is no longer alive, he died in 2015. And then also me and a few other people that worked on the Pacific Project with me and Hugh, we created the companion book for the series. And I feel like it's solid work. I'm still proud of that work. And the companion book for the HBO miniseries, The Pacific, is a book I would recommend.
Got it. Fantastic. Well, thank you for that. I've got one last question for you, Marty. You spent a lot of time with us, and I greatly appreciate it. When you go out and you're on these tours in the Pacific specifically, I think I already know the answer to this question, but I want to confirm it. You're probably going to see a lot more artifacts in their natural state, much like that 60 mm position you guys stumbled on, than you ever would if you're touring a European World War II battlefield. Is there still a lot of hardware, where it stopped, where it got, destroyed or hit or even abandoned, when you're seeing the battlefield almost the way it was when you're touring these places, or has there been a lot of cleanup?
There's been a lot of cleanup, but it's still everywhere. Like a spot that I love to visit on Saipan. I really think Saipan is an incredible place to go. I love the island. The Chamorro and Killian people of Saipan are truly the most hospitable people on planet Earth. They are great. The island is great. I would love to live there. Saipan's incredible, and the battle is absolutely outrageous. And there's still so many spots. Peleliu's not big. It's 36. I'm sorry. Saipan's not big. It's 36 square miles, and it's heavily populated because it's not really that big to begin with. But there are still spots on that island where I can get out of the car and walk not even all that far, and we're in an area where we're finding artifacts. Clearly, the mother of them all is Peleliu. Like a point I love to make about Okinawa is that Okinawa is great because it provides you all of the creature comforts. It provides all of the greatness of being in Japan, and there is nothing left to see here. The Japanese have paved over everything. The island population is so high now, and the area around Naha is so heavily overpopulated that they're original battle sites that they're spiritually just different than they were. Because like at Sugarloaf Hill, where the 6th Marine Division was functionally destroyed during the Battle of Okinawa, there's a big duty-free mall right across the street from it, and the Japanese shaved the sides of Sugarloaf off and then concreted them and put a water tower on top of it.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, so it feels a lot different, and you're not gonna. There are still places where you can stumble onto artifacts like at the Yezudake. I found artifacts there the last time I was on Okinawa, but there's just no comparison with Peleliu, where you literally stumble over them. And that's not just artifacts, but that's also unexploded ordnance and human remains. I found human remains myself on that island. On Saipan, I take visitors to this one spot that it was given this nickname, Harry Carey Gulch, during the battle because, as you're probably aware, the largest banzai bayonet charge of the Second World War, led by the Japanese, is thrown at positions of the 105th Infantry 27th Division on the night of July 7th, 1944. And over the course of that night, the three companies of the battalion were overrun, and there was a lot of intense combat. The Japanese kept sending elements into this attack throughout the pre-dawn hours. And one element, just as the sun was coming up, it ended up going into this gulch. And the Japanese troops that led this part of the assault, when the sun came up, they realized that they were trapped there and that the only way out was going to bring them right into American fire, and that they would be destroyed by the American fire, and that they had no choice. And so many of them killed themselves up in that gulch. And I take people up into that gulch. And I took people up into that gulch last month, and we always find artifacts. I always find the Japanese Type 97 hand grenade. I always find examples of that. Those are clearly very dangerous pieces of unexploded ordnance. I always find unfired small arms ammo. I find plenty of spent casings from Japanese weapons and American weapons. In fact, just to put a finer detail on it, it's very interesting to me that the spent shell casings even ended up telling a bit of a story. So that, and the area of Harry Carey Gulch, I found this one spot where there are shell casings for the 303 cartridge. And I know this is a little bit of nerd content, but the Japanese developed their 7.7 by 58 millimeter rifle cartridge from the British 303 cartridge. And the reason the Japanese developed 7.7 from the 303 cartridge was because the Japanese bought a large number of this machine gun designed by Sir Isaac Newton Lewis, the Lewis gun. And the Lewis light machine gun, was chambered famously in American service in 30 caliber, but the British had them in 303, and the Japanese bought them from the British in 303. And the Japanese found that the cartridge was so effective that they developed their 7.7 millimeter cartridge based on 303. And the big difference is that 303 is a rimmed cartridge, and the Japanese reduced the rim down to the point where it was at first semi-rimmed and then eventually rimless.
Oh, wow.
So when you go up into Harry Carey Gulch, there's a spot where there's just these rimmed cartridges laying everywhere. They're rimmed 303 cartridges. And that was for the Japanese Lewis gun, which in Japanese service, it was adopted as the Type 92 light machine gun. And it was famously used by the Japanese Special Naval Landing Force. And when I take people up into there, we find unexploded hand grenades, spent shell casings, 7.7 millimeter rifle clips. And in this one area, that's nothing but 303 spent casings, where a Japanese, probably a sailor, armed with the Japanese Type 92 Lewis gun, was firing at the enemy. And the shell casings are laying there. I think to most people, they're not so firearms nerdy that they would notice this. But that's something that speaks to me whenever I get there. And I was like, this fight was so serious that the Japanese, first of all, the Japanese had some of the best automatic weapons of the Second World War. Definitely the best light machine gun of World War II in the form of the Type 99. But the Type 92 light machine gun, or the Japanese Lewis gun, was a damn fine weapon. And they were making use of it in Harry Carey Gulch the night of July 7th. And after midnight on the 8th, and probably after dawn on July 8th as well. And the proof is laying up there. And it was also on one trip, I was traveling there in 2012, and I took this doctor from Washington State. We go up into Harry Carey Gulch. I show him the 303 casings, and we're looking around. I found a grenade. We found some rifle casings, and he goes, "Hey, what's this?" And he holds up, and it was a Thompson submachine gun 30-round magazine that still had 45 cartridges in it. And I was like, damn it, you just got the best artifact of them all. And I got nothing. I got jack squat.
Wow.
And I took a photo of him holding it, and it sits on the mantle of his house today, rightly so, because that's a cool artifact. And then less than a minute later, he goes, "Oh, what's this?" And he pulls up a clip from an M1 rifle. And I was like, damn it. You find this stuff. And the two of us were just, our enthusiasm went through the roof. I mean, it's a pretty cool day when you find a loaded Thompson submachine gun magazine.
Heck yeah.
And it was all rusted through, but it's still, you could tell what it was. And then he finds the M1 clip. And then I looked down and I went, oh, look at that. And we stopped what we were doing and we looked down and there's just a big human tooth laying right on the surface.
Oh my
And
gosh.
all that enthusiasm went, I was like, this is a dark place and bad things happened here. That's what you get. And that's Saipan. There are places on Guam that are like that too, just for the record. There are places like that on every one of these islands. And in fact, what you get on these islands, you get it on Peleliu, you get it famously on Guam, famously on Saipan, and you get what they call the last command post, because they're Japanese garrisons that fight to the bitter end. And the garrison commanders in each case sent one last message to the emperor, got a radios to message out, and then carried out the act of seppuku and killed themselves. And the last command post on each of those islands, especially at Peleliu, those are creepy places to go. And that, I think, is what continues to pull me deeper and deeper into this history. I had thought one of these days, certainly by the time I'm 40, I will be tired of going to Pacific Islands at great personal expense to explore them. And I will eventually see everything that can be seen. And that is definitely not happening, because the trip I just got back from last month, I saw things on that trip that I'd never seen before. And I checked them off of a list of things yet to be done. And there are several things on that list that I'm going to hopefully check off this coming year when I return to the Pacific, because the Pacific is much bigger than you are. You will never see it all.
And that's a fantastic way to wrap it up, Marty. Thank you very much for sharing your experiences, your knowledge. I'd certainly learned a lot tonight. And once you go and check a few more things off the list, I look forward to having you back if you're willing to come back.
Of course, I'd love to do that. And what you should do is come with me on one of the Pacific trips. I think you'd like it.
We're going to be talking, that's for sure. So guys, my guest tonight has been Marty Morgan, a fantastic World War II historian, as you have all heard. And he's been talking about his experiences leading battlefield tours in the Pacific, where you not only do you see the strategic implications, but you really can up close and personal immerse yourselves in the challenges faced by soldiers, Marines, airmen, sailors on both sides, and come face to face with the human cost of those battles. So Marty, thank you so much for being on tonight.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you for the compliments once again.